Hello friends, and today we are going to be reading Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone by J.K. Rowling. This is the illustrated version, illustrated by Jim Kay. This week we are going to be reading Chapter 1. Next week we'll go on to Chapter 2 and that. I hope you enjoy. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Lived. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Pivot Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal, thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man, with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large mustache. Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde, and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came in very useful, as she spent so much of her time craning over garden fences, spying on the neighbors. The Dursleys had a small son called Dudley. In their opinion, there was no finer boy anywhere. The Dursleys had everything they wanted, but also had a secret, and their greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. They didn't think that they could bear it if anybody found out about the Potters. Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister, but they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended that she didn't have a sister, because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband were as un-Dursleyish as it was possible to be. The Dursleys shuddered to think what the neighbors would say if the Potters had arrived in the street. The Dursleys knew that the Potters had a small son too, but they had never seen him. This boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They did not want Dudley mixing with a child like that. When Mr. and Mrs. Dursley woke up on the dull gray Tuesday, our story starts. There was nothing about the cloudy sky outside to suggest that a strange, mysterious thing would be happening all over the country. Mr. Dursley hummed as he picked out his most boring tie for work, and Mrs. Dursley gossiped away happily as she wrestled a screaming Dudley into his high chair. None of them noticed a large tawny owl flutter past the window. At 8:30, Mr. Dursley picked up his briefcase. He pecked Mrs. Dursley on the cheek and tried to kiss Dudley good-bye, but missed, because Dudley was now having a tantrum and throwing his cereal against the walls. "Little tyke," chortled Mr. Dursley as he left the house. He got into his car and backed out of number 4's drive. It was on the corner of the street that he noticed the first sign of something peculiar: a cat reading a map. For a second Mr. Dursley did not realize what he had seen. Then he jerked his head around to look again. There was a tabby cat sitting on the corner of Pivot Drive, but there wasn't a map in sight. What would he have been thinking of? It must have been a trick of the light. Mr. Dursley blinked and stared at the cat. It stared back. As Mr. Dursley drove around the corner and up the road, he watched the cat in his mirror. It was now reading the sign that said Pivot Drive. No, looking at the sign. Cats could not read maps or signs. Mr. Dursley gave himself a little shake and put the cat out of his mind. As he drove towards the town, he thought of nothing except large order of drills he was hoping to get that day. But on the edge of town, drills were driven out of his mind by something else. As he sat in the usual morning traffic jam, he couldn't help notice that there seemed to be a lot of strangely dressed people in cloaks. Mr. Dursley couldn't bear people who dressed in funny clothes, the get-ups you saw on young people. He supposed this was some stupid new fashion. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel and his eyes fell on a huddle of weirdos standing quite close by. They were whispering excitedly together. Mr. Dursley was enraged to see that a couple of them weren't young at all. Why, that man had to be older than he was, and he was wearing an emerald green cloak. Emerald green cloak. Who do you think that might be? The nerve of him! But it struck Mr. Dursley that this was probably some silly stunt. These people were obviously collecting for something. Yes, that would be it. The traffic moved on, and a few minutes later Mr. Dursley arrived in the Grunnings car park, his mind back on drills. Mr. Dursley always sat in his back to the window in his office on the 9th floor. If he hadn't, he might have found it harder to concentrate on drills that morning. He didn't see the owls swooping past in the broad daylight, although people down the street did. They pointed and gazed open-mouthed as an owl sped overhead. Most of them had never seen an owl, even at night time. Mr. Dursley, however, had a perfectly normal owl-free morning. He yelled at 5 different people, he made several important telephone calls, and shouted a bit more. He was in a very good mood until lunchtime. Then he thought he'd stretch his legs and walk across the road to buy himself a bun from the baker's opposite. He'd forgotten all about the people in close until he passed a group of them next to the baker's. He eyed them angrily as he passed. He didn't know why, but they made him uneasy. This lot were whispering excitedly too, and he couldn't see a single collecting tin. It was on his way back him, clutching a large doughnut in a bag. That he caught a few words of what they were saying. The Potters. That's right, that's what I heard. Yes, there's some herring. Mr. Dursley stopped dead. Fear flooded him. He wanted to look back at the whisperers as if he wanted to say something to them, but thought better of it. He dashed back across the road, hurrying up to his office, and snapped at his secretary not to disturb him. Seized his telephone, and had almost finished dialing his home number when he changed his mind. He put the receiver back down and stroked his mustache, thinking, no, he was being stupid. Potter wasn't such an unusual name. He was sure there would be lots of people called Potter who had a son Harry. Come to think of it, he wasn't even sure his nephew was called Harry. He had never seen the boy. It might have been Harvey or Harold. There was no point in worrying Mrs. Dursley. She was already gotten so upset at the mention of her sister. He didn't blame her. if he'd had a sister like that. But all the time, those people in cloaks. He had found it a lot harder to concentrate on drills that afternoon when he left the building at 5 o'clock. He was still so worried that he had walked straight into someone just outside the door. "Sorry," he grunted, as the tiny old man stumbled and almost fell. It was a few seconds before Mr. Dursley realized that this man was wearing a violet cloak. He didn't seem at all upset at being almost knocked down to the ground. On the contrary, his face went into a wide smile, and he said in a squeaky voice that made the passers-by stare, "Do not worry, my dear sir, for nothing could upset me today. Rejoice, for you know who has gone at last. Even the Muggles, like yourself, should be celebrating this happy, happy day." And the old man hugged Mr. Dursley around the middle and walked off. Mr. Dursley had stood rooted to the spot. He had been hugged by a complete stranger. He also thought he had been called a Muggle, whatever that was. He was rattled. He hurried over to his car and set off home, hoping he was imagining things which he had never hoped before, because he did not approve of imagination. He pulled into the driveway of number 4. The first thing he saw, and it did not improve his mood, was the tabby cat he'd spotted that morning. It was now sitting on the garden wall. He was sure it was the same one. It had the same markings around its eyes. "Shoo!" said Mr. Dursley loudly. The cat did not move. It just gave him a stern look. Was this normal cat behavior? Mr. Dursley wondered, trying to pull himself together. He let himself into the house. He was still determined not to mention anything to his wife. Mrs. Dursley had had a nice normal day. She told him all over dinner about what Mrs. Next Door's problems were with her daughter, and now Dudley had learned a new word, shan't. Mr. Dursley tried to act normally. When Dudley had been trying to put to bed, he went into the living room in time to catch the last report on the evening news. And finally, bird watchers everywhere have been reported that the nation's owls have been behaving very unusually today. Although owls normally hunt at night and are hardly ever seen at daylight, there have been hundreds sightings of these birds flying in every direction since sunrise. Experts are unable to explain why the owls have suddenly changed their sleeping pattern. The new reader allowed himself to grin. Most mysterious. And now we are going over to Jeff McGuffin from the weather. How going to be any more showers of owls tonight, Jim? "Well, Ted," said the weatherman, "I don't know about that, but not only the owls have been acting oddly today. Viewers as far apart as Kent, Yorkshire, and Dundee have been phoning all day to tell me that instead of rain that I promised yesterday, there would be a downpour of shooting stars. Perhaps people would have been celebrating bonfire night early, but it's not until next week, folks. But I can't promise them a wet night tonight." Mr. Dursley sat frozen in his armchair. Shooting stars all over Britain, owls flying by daylight, mysterious people in cloaks all over the place, and a whisper about the Potters. Mrs. Dursley came into the living room and carried 2 cups of tea. It was no good. He'd have to say something to her. He cleared his throat nervously. Petunia, dear, haven't you heard from your sister lately, have you?" As he had expected, Mrs. Dursley looked shocked and angry. After all, they normally pretended she didn't have a sister. "No," she said sharply. "Why?" "Funny stuff on the news." Mr. Dursley mumbled. "Owls, shooting stars, and there were a lot of funny-looking people in town today. Well, I just thought maybe it was something to do with, her lot." Mrs. Dursley slipped her tea through Prue's lips. Mr. Dursley wondered whether he had dared to tell her that he had heard the name Potter. He decided he didn't dare. Instead, he said casually, as he could, "Their son, he'd be about Dudley's age now, wouldn't he?" "I suppose so," said Mrs. Dursley stiffly. "What's his name again? Howard, isn't it? Harry nasty common name, if you ask me." "Oh, yes," said Mr. Dursley, his heart sinking horribly. "Yes, I quite agree." He didn't dare say another word on the subject as they went upstairs to bed. While Mrs. Dursley went to the bathroom, Mr. Dudley crept to the bedroom window and peered down to the front garden. The cat was still there. It was staring down Pivot Drive, as though it was waiting for something. Was he imagining things? How could could this all have to do with the Potters? If it did, if it got out that they were related to a pair of, well, he didn't think he could bear it. The Dursleys got into bed. Mrs. Dursley had fell asleep quickly, but Mr. Dursley lay wide awake, turning it all over his mind. At last, comforting thought before he fell asleep was that if the Potters were even involved, there was no reason for them to come near him and Mrs. Dursley. The Potters knew very well that he and Petunia had thought about them and their kind. He couldn't see how he and Petunia would get mixed up with anything that might be going on. He yawned and turned over. It couldn't affect them. Oh, and how very wrong he was. Mr. Dursley might have been drifting into an uneasy sleep, but the cat on the wall outside was showing no sign of sleepiness. It was sitting still as a statue, its eyes fixed unblinkingly on the far corner of Pivot Drive. It didn't so much as quiver when a door slammed in the next street, nor when 2 owls swooped overhead. In fact, it was nearly midnight before the cat moved at all. A man appeared on the corner. The cat had been watching. Appeared so suddenly and silently that he just popped up out of the ground. The cat's tail twitched and its eyes narrowed. Nothing like this man had ever been seen in Pivot Drive. He was tall, thin, and very old, judging by the silver of his hair and beard, which were both long enough to tuck into his belt. He was wearing long robes, a purple cloak which swept the bottom of the ground, and high-heeled buckled boots. His blue eyes were light, bright, and sparkling behind half-moon spectacles, and his nose was very long and crooked, as though it had been broken at least twice. This man's name was Albus Dumbledore. Albus Dumbledore didn't seem to realize that he had just arrived in a street where everything from his name to his boots was unwelcome. He was busy rummaging in his cloak, looking for something, but he did seem to realize that he was being watched, because he looked up suddenly at the cat, which was still staring at him from the other end of the street. For some reason, the sight of the cat seemed to amuse him. He chuckled and muttered, "I should have known." He had found what he was looking for inside his pocket. It had seemed to be a silver cigarette lighter. He flicked it open, held it up in the air, and clicked it. The nearest street lamp went out with a little pop. He clicked it again. The next lamp flickered into the darkness. 12 times he clicked the put-outer, until only the lights left in the whole street were 2 tiny pinpricks in the distance, which were the eyes of the cat watching him. If anyone looked out of their window now, not even the beady-eyed Mrs. Dursley would be able to see anything that was happening down on the pavement. Dumbledore slipped the put-outer back inside his cloak and set down the streets towards number 4, where he sat down on the wall next to the cat. He didn't look at it, but after a moment he spoke to it. "Fancy seeing you here, Professor McGonagall." He turned to smile at the tabby, but it had gone. Instead he was smiling at a rather severe-looking woman who was wearing square glasses exactly the same shape of the marking the cat had around its eyes. She too was wearing a cloak, an emerald one. Her black hair was drawn into a tight bun. She looked indistantly ruffled. "How did you know it was me?" she asked. "My dear Professor, I have never seen a cat sit so stiffly." "You'd be stiff if you had been sitting on a brick wall all day," said Professor McGonagall. "All day, when you could have been celebrating? I might have passed a dozen feasts and parties on my way here." Professor McGonagall sniffed angrily. "Oh yes, everybody's celebrating all right. You'd think they'd be a bit more careful. But no, not even the Muggles had noticed something's going on. It was on their news." She jerked her head back to the Dursley's dark living room. "I heard it. Flocks of owls shooting stars. Well, they're not completely stupid. They were bound to notice something. Shooting stars down in Kent. I bet that was Deedless Diggle. He never had much sense." "You can't blame them," said Dumbledore gently. "We have had precious little to celebrate for 11 years." "I know that," said Professor McGonagall irritably, "but that's no reason to lose our heads. People are being downright careless, put out on the street in broad daylight, not even dressed in Muggle clothes, swapping rumors." She threw a sharp sideways glance at Dumbledore here, as though hoping he was going to tell her something, but he didn't. So she went on. "A fine thing it would be if on the very day you know who seems to have disappeared, at last the Muggles had found about us all. I suppose he really has gone, Dumbledore." "It certainly seems so," said Dumbledore. "We have much to be thankful for. Would you care for a sherbet lemon?" "A what?" A sherbet lemon. They're kind of muggle sweet I'm rather fond of. No, thank you, said Professor McGonagall coldly, as though she didn't think this was the moment for sherbet lemons. As I say, even if you know who has gone, my dear Professor, surely a sensible person like yourself can call him by his name. All this you-know-who nonsense. For 11 years I have been trying to persuade people to call him by his proper name, Voldemort. Professor McGonagall flinched, but Dumbledore, who was unsticking 2 sherbet lemons, seemed not to notice. It all gets so confusing if we keep saying you-know-who. I never have seen any reason to be frightened by saying Voldemort's name. I know you haven't, said Professor McGonagall, sounding half exasperating, half admiring. But you're different. Everybody knows you're the only one. You know who. Oh, all right. Voldemort was frightened of. You flatter me, said Dumbledore calmly. Voldemort had powers I will never have, only because you're too, well, noble to use them. It's lucky it's dark. I haven't blushed so much since Madame Pomfrey told me she liked my new earmuffs. Professor McGonagall shot a sharp look at Dumbledore and said, "The owls are nothing to do with the rumors that are flying around. You know what everyone's saying and why he's disappeared? About what finally stopped him?" It seemed Professor McGonagall had reached the point she was most anxious to discuss. The real reason she had been waiting on a cold, hard wall all day for neither as cat nor woman, as she fixed Dumbledore with such a piercing stare as she did now. It was as plain that whatever everyone was saying, she was not going to believe it until Dumbledore told her it was true. Dumbledore, however, was choosing another sherbet lemon, and did not answer. What they're saying is that last night Voldemort turned up in Godric's Hollow. He went to find the Potters. The rumor is that Lily and James Potter are 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 that they're dead. Dumbledore bowed his head. Professor McGonagall gasped. Lily and James. I can't believe it. I did not want to believe it. Oh, Albus. Dumbledore reached out and patted her on the shoulder. I know, he said heavily. Professor McGonagall's voice trembled as she went on. That's not all. They're saying he tried to kill Potter's son, Harry, but he couldn't. He couldn't kill that little boy. Nobody knows why or how, but they're saying that when he couldn't kill Harry Potter, Voldemort's power somehow broke, and that's why he's gone. Dumbledore nodded glumly. It's true? Flattered Professor McGonagall. After all he's done, all the people he's killed, he couldn't kill a little boy? It's just astounding of all things to stop him. But how in the name of heaven did Harry survive? We can only guess, said Dumbledore. We may never know. Professor McGonagall pulled out a lace handkerchief and dabbed her eyes beneath her spectacles. Dumbledore gave a great sniff as he took a golden watch from his pocket and examined it. It was a very odd watch. It had 12 hands but no numbers. Instead, little planets were moving around the edge. It must have made sense to Dumbledore, though, because he put it back in his pocket and said, Hagrid's late. I suppose it was he who told you I'd be here, by the way. Yes, said Professor McGonagall, and I don't suppose you're going to tell me why you're here, of all places. I have come to bring Harry to his aunt and uncle. They're the only family he has left now. You don't mean, you can't mean the people who live here, cried Professor McGonagall, jumping to her feet and pointing at number 4. Dumbledore, you can't. I've been watching them all day. You couldn't find 2 more people who are less like us. And they've got this son. I saw him kicking his mother all the way up the street, screaming for sweets. Harry Potter, come and live here. It's the best place for him, said Dumbledore firmly. His aunt and uncle will be able to explain everything to him when he's older. I've written them a letter. A letter, repeated Professor McGonagall faintly, sitting back on the wall. Really, Dumbledore, do you think you can explain all this in a letter? These people will never understand him. He'll be famous, a legend. I wouldn't be surprised if today was known as Harry Potter Day in the future. There will be books written about Harry. Every child in the world will know his name. Exactly, said Dumbledore, looking serious over the top of his half-moon glasses. It would be enough to turn any boy's head. Famous before he can walk and talk. Famous for something he won't even remember. Can't you see how much better off he'll be growing up away from all of this until he's ready to take it? Professor McGonagall opened her mouth, changed her mind, and swallowed, and then said, Yes, you're right, of course. But how is the boy getting here, Dumbledore? She eyed his cloak suddenly, as though he might be hiding Harry underneath. Hagrid's bringing him. You think it wise to trust Hagrid with something as important as this? I would trust Hagrid with my life, said Dumbledore. I'm not saying his heart isn't in the right place, said Professor McGonagall grudgingly. But you can't pretend that he's not careless. He does tend to... What was that? A low rumbling sound had broken the silence around him. It grew steadily louder as they looked up and down the street for some sign of a headlight. It swelled to a roar as they both looked up at the sky, and then a huge motorbike fell out of the air and landed on the road in front of them. If the motorbike was huge, it was nothing to the man sitting astride it. He was almost twice as tall as the normal man, and at least 5 times wide. He looked simply too big to be allowed, and so wild. Long tangles of bushy black hair and beard hid most of his face, and his hands, the size of dustbins, lids, and his feet in their leather boots were like baby dolphins. In his vast muscular arms he was holding a bundle of blankets. Hagrid, oh my God. Hagrid, said Dumbledore, sounding relieved. At last. And where did you get that motorbike? Borrowed it, Professor Dumbledore, sir, said the giant, climbing carefully off of the motorbike as he spoke. Young Sirius Black lent it to me. I've got him, sir. No problems, were there? No, sir. The house was almost destroyed, but I got him out all right before the muggles started swarming around. He fell asleep as we were flying over Bristol. Dumbledore and Professor McGonagall bent forward over the bundle of blankets. Inside, just visible, was a baby boy, fast asleep, under a tuft of jet black hair over his forehead. Before they could see the curiously shaped cut like a bolt of lightning. "Is that where?" whispered Professor McGonagall. "Yes," said Dumbledore. "He'll have that scar forever." "Couldn't you do something about it, Dumbledore?" Even if I could, I wouldn't. Scars can come in useful. I have one myself, above my left knee, which is a perfect map of the London Underground. Well, give him here, Hagrid. We'd better get this over with." Dumbledore took Harry in his arms and turned toward the Dursleys' house. Could I just say good-bye to him, sir?" asked Hagrid. He bent his head, his great shaggy head, over Harry, and gave him what must have been a very scratchy, whiskery kiss. And then suddenly Hagrid let out a howl like a wounded dog. "Shh!" said Professor McGonagall. "You'll wake the Muggles." Sorry," sobbed Hagrid, taking out a large spotted handkerchief and burying his face in it. But I can't stand it. Lily and James dead, and poor little Harry off to live with Muggles." Yes, it's all very sad, but get a grip on yourself, Hagrid, or we'll be found," Professor McGonagall whispered, patting Harry gingerly on the arm as Dumbledore stepped over the low garden and walked to the front door. He had laid Harry gently on the doorstep and took a letter out of his cloak, tucked it inside Harry's blankets, and then came back to the other two. For a full minute the three of them stood and looked at the little bundle. Hagrid's shoulders shook. Professor McGonagall blinked furiously, and the twinkling light that usually shone from Dumbledore's eyes seemed to have gone out. "Well," said Dumbledore finally, "that's that. We have no business staying here. We may as well go and join the celebrations." "Yeah," said Hagrid, in a very muffled voice. "I'd best take this bike away. Good night, Professor McGonagall. Professor Dumbledore, sir." Wiping his streaming eyes on his jacket sleeve, Hagrid swung himself onto the motorbike and kicked the giant engine to life. With a roar it rose into the air and off into the night. "I shall see you soon, I expect, Professor McGonagall," said Dumbledore, nodding to her. Professor McGonagall blew her nose in reply. Dumbledore turned and walked back down the street. On the corner he stopped and took out the silver outer. He clicked it once, and 12 balls of light sped back into the street lamps so that Pivot Drive glowed suddenly orange, and he could make out a tabby cat slinking around the corner at the other end of the street. He could just see the bundle of blankets on the step of number 4. "Good luck, Harry," he murmured. He turned on his heel with the switch of his cloak. He was gone. A breeze ruffled the neat hedges of Pivot Drive, which lay silent and tidy under the inky sky, the very last place you would expect astonishing things to happen. Harry Potter rolled over inside his blankets without waking up. One small hand closed on the letter beside him, and he slept on, not knowing he was special, not knowing he was famous, not knowing he would be woken in a few hours' time by Mrs. Dursley's scream as she opened the front milk to put out the milk bottles, nor that he would spend the next few weeks being prodded and pinched pinched by his cousin Dudley. He would not know that this very moment the people, meeting in secret all over the country, were holding up their glasses and saying in hushed voices, "To Harry Potter, the boy who lived." And that is it with the first chapter of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, illustrated by Jim Kay. Thank you for watching this video. Make sure to click like and subscribe and follow me. Thank you. Goodbye. Have a nice day.